The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Jefferson Grand Hotel ballroom, and 500 pairs of eyes turned to watch my humiliation. My sister Victoria stood on the stage in her $8,000 gown, microphone in hand, laughing as she pointed directly at me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my little sister Sarah over there in the clearance rack dress. Yes, the one who couldn't even afford the ticket price tonight. I had to comp her in out of pity. Her voice carried across the silent room, each word landing like a slap. Some of us build empires. Others just drift through life hoping someone else will pay their way. The crowd's uncomfortable laughter felt like needles against my skin. I stood frozen near the hors d'oeuvres table, wearing the navy dress I'd bought on sale at Macy's for $79. Around me, Virginia's elite shifted in their designer clothes, their eyes full of pity and judgment. My mother sat at the family table, staring at her plate. My father's face had gone red, but not with anger at Victoria. With shame. Shame at me. What none of them knew, what I'd kept carefully hidden for 3 years, was that the Purple Heart my grandmother had left me wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a key to something much bigger. Something that would make this moment of humiliation the biggest mistake Victoria would ever make. My name is Sarah Bennett, and I'm about to tell you how my successful sister tried to destroy me at her own charity gala, not knowing that the quiet, broke little sister she'd been mocking for years was actually Colonel Sarah Bennett, decorated combat veteran and the real owner of the $4.2 million property she'd been scheming to steal. 3 hours before Victoria destroyed what was left of our relationship in front of Richmond's most powerful people, I'd been sitting in my small office at Magnolia Gardens Apartments, reviewing maintenance requests and trying to figure out how I was going to afford new water heaters for Units 7 and 12. At 38 years old, I wasn't where I thought I'd be. 15 years of military service, 2 deployments, a Bronze Star, and somehow I'd ended up managing a veterans housing complex that barely broke even each month. But I'd never regretted the choice. Walking through Magnolia Gardens meant seeing Jerry Morrison teaching his daughter to ride a bike in the courtyard after losing his legs in Kandahar. It meant watching Maria Santos graduate from nursing school after 3 tours as a combat medic left her with PTSD so severe she couldn't hold down a regular job for 2 years. It meant knowing that 45 families had stable homes at rents they could actually afford, $650 to $900 a month in a city where studios were going for $1,500. My phone had buzzed that morning with a text from Victoria. Her messages were always commands, never requests. Gala tonight. 7 p.m. You're coming. Wear something appropriate for once. This is important for the family image. The family image. That's all Victoria had cared about since she'd clawed her way up from middle management to vice president of Meridian Luxury Events, the premier event planning company on the East Coast. She'd built her reputation creating galas and fundraisers for corporations that wanted to look charitable without actually being charitable. Her own foundation, the Bennett Foundation for Veterans, had launched 18 months ago with a press release that made it sound like she'd personally saved every struggling veteran in Virginia. What the press release didn't mention was that only 8% of the foundation's donations actually went to veterans. The rest disappeared into administrative costs, which was a polite way of saying Victoria's Mercedes payments, her country club dues, and her brownstone mortgage in Richmond's most exclusive neighborhood. I discovered this 6 months ago while helping Eleanor Hayes, a retired lieutenant colonel and my grandmother's best friend, review charity filings for legitimate veteran organizations. Eleanor had spotted Victoria's foundation on the state registry and pulled the public records out of curiosity. What we found made my stomach turn. But that discovery was nothing compared to what I'd found 3 weeks ago, hidden in my grandmother's hope chest at my parents' house. I'd been looking for Grandma Maggie's recipe book, something to remember her by on what would have been her 86th birthday. Instead, I'd found documents that changed everything. Legal papers establishing the Maggie Bennett Memorial Trust, formed 3 years before she died. Property deeds transferring Magnolia Gardens from her name to the trust. And a letter, written in her shaky handwriting during her final weeks, that began with words I'd never forget. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then Victoria has finally shown her true colors. I've known for some time that your sister sees Magnolia Gardens as nothing but money waiting to be harvested. That's why I've taken steps to protect it, and to protect you. The trust documents named me as the sole beneficiary and administrator. I owned Magnolia Gardens outright. I had for 3 years without knowing it. Grandmother had structured everything through a lawyer named Thomas Crawford, who'd kept the arrangement confidential per her instructions. The property appeared to be owned by the trust, which was managed by a Delaware-registered entity that Victoria would never think to investigate. On paper, to anyone who didn't dig deep enough, Magnolia Gardens looked like it was still part of the family estate, controlled by my parents and subject to family decisions. Victoria had been making those family decisions without me for months. Eleanor had helped me piece together the timeline. Secret meetings with my parents and Uncle Richard. Conference calls with developers from Pinnacle Properties Group. Preliminary architectural drawings for luxury condominiums that would replace Magnolia Gardens, 45 units of affordable housing with 12 units of million-dollar residences. All of it happening while I managed the property, fixed the plumbing, organized community dinners, and made sure Jerry Morrison's daughter had a safe place to ride her bike. I'd wanted to confront Victoria immediately when I found the documents. Eleanor had stopped me with the same strategic mind that had made her one of the most respected officers in her field. Let her make her move, Eleanor had said, sitting in her Georgetown townhouse surrounded by military memorabilia and photographs from 3 decades of service. Right now, she thinks she's operating from a position of power. Let her get comfortable with that feeling. Let her show everyone exactly who she is. Then we move. So I'd waited. I'd played the role of the struggling property manager, the disappointment daughter, the sister who couldn't get her life together. I'd listened to my mother's concerned phone calls about when I was going to find a real career. I'd endured my father's sighs every time Victoria's accomplishments came up at family dinners. I'd watched Victoria preen and pose on social media, her foundation galas getting bigger and more elaborate while actual veterans struggled to find housing. And now, standing in the Jefferson Grand Hotel ballroom with champagne soaking into my clearance rack dress and 500 people staring at me like I was something Victoria had scraped off her designer shoe, I understood what Eleanor had meant. This was the move. This was Victoria showing everyone exactly who she was, live and in person, in front of witnesses who mattered. What she didn't know was that among those 500 people was Governor Patricia Caldwell, who'd personally pinned my Bronze Star on my uniform 2 years ago after a humanitarian mission that had saved 43 lives. Also in attendance was Major General Richard Torres, who'd commanded my unit during my second deployment. And sitting quietly at a corner table, watching everything with sharp eyes, was Eleanor Hayes herself, who'd made sure certain people received invitations to tonight's event. The trap was set. Victoria had just walked into it. And I was about to let her dig herself in deeper before I revealed that the broke little sister she'd been mocking was actually the one person standing between her and the fortune she thought she'd already stolen. Victoria wasn't finished with her performance. She gestured grandly from the stage, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light as she addressed the crowd with practiced charm. But seriously, folks, this gala represents everything the Bennett Foundation stands for. Lifting up those who've fallen behind. Giving opportunities to those who can't seem to find their footing. My sister here is actually the perfect example of why this work matters so much. The applause that followed felt like a physical assault. I watched my mother finally look up from her plate, her eyes pleading with me to just smile, to play along, to not make a scene that would embarrass Victoria further. My father had his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. He was angry, but not at Victoria. Never at Victoria. I could have left. Should have left, probably. Walked out of that ballroom with whatever dignity I had remaining and let Victoria have her moment of triumph. But Eleanor had taught me something during my years in the service. Sometimes retreat is strategic. Sometimes you hold your position because abandoning it means losing something more important than pride. So I stayed. I picked up another champagne flute from a passing server, ignored the pitying looks from the people around me, and made my way to the family table where my parents sat with Uncle Richard and his wife Linda. They all went silent as I approached, like I was a bomb that might detonate if they said the wrong thing. "Sarah," my mother whispered urgently, "maybe you should go home and change." Come back after the speeches? After the humiliation had time to fade from people's memories, she meant. After Victoria had received her applause and accolades and I was no longer a visible reminder of the family's lesser daughter. I'm fine right here, Mom, I said quietly, taking the empty seat next to her. Uncle Richard shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with my father that I wasn't supposed to notice. I'd seen that look before. The look that said they'd been discussing me, making decisions about me, having conversations I wasn't invited to join. Honey, Victoria didn't mean anything by it, my mother tried again, her voice strained. You know how she is with public speaking. Sometimes she just gets carried away trying to be funny. Funny. My sister had just told 500 people that I was a charity case, that I couldn't afford basic necessities, that my entire existence was an example of failure that her foundation existed to fix. And my mother was calling it humor. How much did she tell you? I asked, keeping my voice level. About Magnolia Gardens? The silence at the table grew heavier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Uncle Richard cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. Linda excused herself to the restroom. My father's face went from red to purple. Sarah, this isn't the time, he said through gritted teeth. Actually, Dad, I think it's exactly the time. You've been having meetings about my property. Making plans for its future. I'm just curious how much Victoria shared with you about those plans. My mother's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. Lower your voice. People are looking. They weren't, actually. The gala had moved on from my humiliation to the next phase of the evening. Waiters circulated with the first course. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Victoria held court near the stage, surrounded by admirers congratulating her on another successful event. But my mother lived in constant fear of what people might think, might say, might judge about our family. How much is she offering you? I pressed. For your share of what you think is the family property? It's a generous offer, Uncle Richard interjected, apparently deciding we were having this conversation whether he wanted to or not. 2 million for your parents' stake, 1 million for mine. And before you get upset, Victoria made sure there's 500,000 set aside for you. That's more than fair, considering you've just been managing the place, not actually building any equity. 500,000. Out of a $6.8 million sale to Pinnacle Properties Group. They'd already negotiated the whole deal, divided up money from a property they didn't own, and allocated me a fraction as if they were doing me a favor. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. My father finally met my eyes. We're telling you now. The papers are being drawn up next week. Victoria's handling all the legal work through her firm's real estate attorneys. This is a good thing, Sarah. That money could set you up. You could go back to school, get a real career going, stop living paycheck to paycheck in that rundown building. A real career. As if 15 years of military service meant nothing. As if managing a complex that housed 45 veteran families was just killing time until I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. And the residents? I asked. The people living in Magnolia Gardens? What happens to them? Uncle Richard waved his hand dismissively. They'll have 60 days to relocate. Standard procedure. Victoria says most of them are month to month anyway. They'll find other places. 45 families, most of them veterans struggling with disabilities, PTSD, or simply the challenge of transitioning back to civilian life in an economy that didn't value their service. They'd find other places in a city where rent had doubled in 5 years, where a studio apartment cost more than their disability checks, where landlords saw their service-related issues as liabilities rather than sacrifices. I thought about Jerry Morrison, who'd spent 6 months sleeping in his car after he came home from Walter Reed because no apartment complex would rent to him with his wheelchair and service dog. I thought about Maria Santos, whose nightmares meant she needed understanding neighbors who wouldn't call the cops every time she woke up screaming. I thought about old Henry Park, who'd served in Vietnam and still couldn't talk about what he'd seen, who sat on his balcony every evening feeding the stray cats and finally had a place that felt like home. 60 days to relocate. Standard procedure. You can't sell Magnolia Gardens, I said quietly. It's already decided, my father said firmly. Family vote was unanimous. 3-1, if you want to be technical about it, since you weren't at the meeting. But Victoria assured us you'd see reason once you understood the financial opportunity. 3-1. They'd held a vote on my property without inviting me, then counted my absence as agreement. The audacity was almost impressive. Sarah, please, my mother whispered, her hand clutching my arm. Don't make this difficult. Think about what that money could mean for you. You could buy your own place, something nice. You wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. She genuinely thought she was being kind. Thought she was looking out for my best interests. She'd chosen Victoria's version of success over everything I'd tried to build, and she thought it was love. I was saved from responding by the sound of silverware clinking against crystal. Victoria had returned to the stage, radiant and confident, ready to deliver her keynote address about the importance of supporting veterans. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Good evening again, everyone, Victoria's voice rang out, amplified and smooth. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for opening your hearts and your wallets to such an important cause. Our veterans gave everything for this country, and the least we can do is ensure they have the support they need to thrive. Applause rippled through the room. I watched people nodding, saw checkbooks emerging from purses and jacket pockets. They had no idea that 92 cents of every dollar they donated would never reach a single veteran. They saw Victoria's polished presentation, her designer gown, her confident smile, and they believed they were part of something meaningful. The Bennett Foundation has helped over 300 veterans this year alone, Victoria continued, numbers she'd carefully crafted to sound impressive without being specific enough to verify. We've provided job training, housing assistance, and mental health resources. But there's so much more work to do. Housing assistance. I almost laughed. The only housing assistance Victoria had provided was assistance in evicting veterans from the one place in Richmond where they could afford to live. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from Eleanor. Perfect. She's giving us everything we need. Recording? I glanced around carefully, then sent back a quick confirmation. Eleanor had equipped me with a small recording device, barely larger than a button, pinned to my dress collar. Every word spoken at this table had been captured. Every casual dismissal of veteran families, every greedy division of money they didn't have the right to claim, every piece of evidence we'd need when this all came to light. And now, Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of practiced humility, I want to introduce someone very special. A woman who embodies everything we're trying to achieve with this foundation. Someone who understands service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Virginia's own Governor Patricia Caldwell. The room erupted in applause as Governor Caldwell rose from her seat 3 tables away. I'd noticed her earlier but hadn't realized Victoria had invited her as the keynote speaker. This was going to be interesting. Governor Caldwell took the stage with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades in public service. She shook Victoria's hand, accepted the microphone, and surveyed the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When her gaze landed on me, I saw the briefest flicker of recognition before she turned her attention to the crowd. Thank you, Ms. Bennett, for that warm introduction, the governor began. I'm honored to be here tonight supporting such vital work. Veterans' issues are close to my heart, as many of you know. I've had the privilege of meeting countless service members throughout my career, and each one has taught me something about courage, dedication, and selflessness. She paused, and in that pause, I felt the energy in the room shift slightly. Something in her tone, in the way she held herself, suggested this wasn't going to be the standard political speech Victoria had expected. Which is why, Governor Caldwell continued, I'm always particularly interested in meeting the people behind organizations like the Bennett Foundation. I like to know who's really doing the work, who's making the sacrifices, who's putting service above self. Victoria beamed from her position at the side of the stage, clearly believing this praise was directed at her. The governor's next words changed everything. So imagine my surprise when I arrived tonight and saw someone I recognize very well, standing right over there. She pointed directly at me. Someone whose service to this country and this state has been extraordinary, though she's far too modest to ever mention it herself. The ballroom went completely silent. 500 people turned to stare at me again, but this time the energy was different. Confused. Curious. My mother's grip on my arm tightened until her nails dug into my skin. My father had gone perfectly still, his wine glass suspended halfway to his lips. Victoria's smile had frozen on her face, her eyes darting between me and the governor with an expression I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Fear, maybe. She had no idea what was coming, but some instinct was screaming at her that she'd miscalculated badly. Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Caldwell continued, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room, I'd like to ask Colonel Sarah Bennett to please stand. The title hit the room like a shockwave. Colonel. My mother made a small choking sound. Uncle Richard's chair scraped backward as he half stood, then sat again, his face pale. My father simply stared, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I rose slowly, feeling every eye in the ballroom lock onto me. My clearance rack dress suddenly felt irrelevant. The champagne stain on my sleeve disappeared from my awareness. I stood straight, shoulders back, chin level, falling into the posture that had been drilled into me for 15 years of service. Colonel Bennett and I first met 2 years ago, Governor Caldwell said, when I had the honor of presenting her with the Bronze Star for Valor during a humanitarian mission in northern Iraq. Her unit was providing security for medical personnel when their convoy came under attack. Despite being injured herself, Colonel Bennett coordinated the defense, evacuated 17 wounded civilians, and maintained control of the situation for 4 hours until reinforcements arrived. She saved 43 lives that day. The silence in the room had transformed into something electric. I could feel the shift happening, the narrative Victoria had carefully constructed about the failure sister crumbling in real time. Several people had pulled out their phones, no doubt searching my name, finding articles I'd never mentioned, commendations I'd never displayed, a service record I'd kept carefully hidden from a family that had never asked about it. But that's just one mission, the governor continued. Colonel Bennett served 3 tours overseas, led training operations for coalition forces, and developed strategic protocols that are still in use today. After transitioning to reserve status, she could have taken any number of high-paying positions in the private sector. Defense contractors were apparently lining up to recruit her. Victoria had moved to the edge of the stage now, her perfect composure showing cracks. She was trying to smile, trying to look proud, but her eyes were calculating, already working on how to spin this, how to make it part of her narrative somehow. Instead, Governor Caldwell said, and her voice took on a warmth that made my chest tighten, Colonel Bennett chose to serve in a different way. She took over management of Magnolia Gardens Apartments, a facility that provides affordable housing specifically for veterans and their families. She spent the last 3 years making sure that the men and women who served this country have a safe place to call home. My mother had released my arm. She sat frozen, staring up at me like I was a stranger. In some ways, I suppose I was. She'd never asked about my time in the service beyond the vague acknowledgement that I'd been in the army. She'd never wanted details about deployments, missions, the reasons I sometimes woke up gasping in the middle of the night. It was easier to see me as the daughter who couldn't quite get her life together than to confront what service actually meant. I've visited Magnolia Gardens twice in the past year, the governor said. Once officially, once unannounced. Both times, I saw something remarkable. A community. Families who'd been struggling finding stability. Veterans dealing with PTSD receiving support from neighbors who understood. Children playing safely in a courtyard maintained with obvious care. And at the center of it all, Colonel Bennett, who knows every resident by name, remembers their stories, and treats their needs as seriously as any military operation. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. Several people were openly wiping their eyes. A man at a nearby table, wearing a small American flag lapel pin, had stood and was looking at me with an expression of profound respect. Others were following suit, rising from their seats. "So when I received an invitation to tonight's gala," Governor Caldwell said, her tone shifting subtly, "supporting a foundation supposedly dedicated to helping veterans, I was very interested to attend. I wanted to see how the Bennett Foundation's work compared to the actual, on-the-ground service that Colonel Bennett has been providing. I wanted to understand where the donations were really going." Victoria's face had gone white. She took a step forward, reaching for the microphone, but Governor Caldwell smoothly turned away from her, continuing without pause. "What I found was troubling. Public records show that the Bennett Foundation for Veterans reported taking in $1.2 million in donations last year. Of that amount, only $96,000 went to direct veteran services. 8%. The remaining 92% was categorized as administrative costs." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People were looking at Victoria now with very different expressions. Donors who'd just written checks were pulling out phones, likely texting their banks to stop payment. The man with the flag pin had sat back down, but his jaw was clenched with visible anger. "Now, I'm not here to make accusations," Governor Caldwell said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm sure there are explanations for those numbers. But I am here to make sure that when people in this room donate to help veterans, they know the difference between someone who talks about service and someone who lives it." She turned back to me, extending her hand in invitation. "Colonel Bennett, would you please join me up here?" I moved through the ballroom in a daze, aware of the standing ovation building around me, of Victoria backing away from the front of the stage, of my parents' shocked faces receding as I climbed the steps. Governor Caldwell gripped my hand firmly when I reached her, the gesture both congratulatory and protective. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice rising over the applause, "I want to make an announcement. Effective immediately, the Commonwealth of Virginia is establishing a special grant program for veteran housing initiatives. The first recipient of this grant, in the amount of $500,000, will be Magnolia Gardens Apartments, to be used for facility improvements, expanded services, and ensuring long-term sustainability." The applause grew louder. I stood there, overwhelmed, as Governor Caldwell handed me a ceremonial check. $500,000. The exact amount my family had planned to give me as a pittance from selling property I actually owned. The irony wasn't lost on me, and based on the governor's slight smile, it wasn't lost on her either. "Furthermore," she continued, "I'm directing the Virginia Attorney General's office to conduct a thorough review of all charitable organizations in the state claiming to serve veterans. We need to ensure that donor funds are being used appropriately and that the people running these organizations have the expertise and integrity to do the work they claim to be doing." Victoria had disappeared from the stage entirely now. I caught a glimpse of her red dress as she pushed through the crowd toward the exit, her phone already pressed to her ear. Calling her lawyers, probably. Or maybe calling my parents to blame them somehow for this disaster. It didn't matter. The facade had cracked wide open, and everyone in this room had seen what was underneath. Governor Caldwell leaned close as the applause continued. Eleanor Hayes filled me in on everything. The property scheme, the embezzlement, all of it. My office has been quietly investigating for 3 weeks. We have enough evidence to move forward with charges if you're ready. I'm ready, I whispered back. She nodded, squeezing my shoulder before returning to the microphone for her closing remarks. I stood beside her, still holding the oversized check, watching my parents' faces in the crowd. My mother was crying, though I couldn't tell if it was shame or shock or some combination of both. My father had his head in his hands. Uncle Richard and Linda had left their table entirely, probably following Victoria out the door to regroup and figure out how to minimize the damage to their own reputations. As the governor finished her speech and the crowd began to disperse, people approached in waves. Veterans I'd never met shaking my hand with tears in their eyes. Donors who wanted to contribute directly to Magnolia Gardens. Business leaders offering support, connections, resources. A retired general pressed his card into my palm and told me to call him about a position on the State Veterans Affairs Board. Through it all, I kept watching the exit where Victoria had fled. She'd spent the entire evening mocking me, dismissing me, using me as an example of everything she'd risen above. She thought tonight would cement her position as Richmond's premier philanthropist, the Bennett sister who'd made something of herself. Instead, she'd exposed herself in front of everyone who mattered. The donors, the politicians, the business leaders she'd cultivated so carefully. They'd all seen the truth now. Not because I'd confronted her privately, but because she'd been so confident in her superiority that she'd destroyed herself in public. Eleanor appeared at my elbow as the crowd finally began to thin. She looked satisfied in the way of a chess player who'd just executed a strategy perfectly. "Well played, Colonel." "I didn't do anything," I said. "I just stood there." "Exactly," she smiled. "You held your position. Let the enemy overextend. Classic military strategy. Now comes the hard part." She was right. This public exposure was just the opening move. The real battle would be proving the fraud, documenting the embezzlement, building a case that would stand up in court. My family would close ranks around Victoria, try to protect her, possibly turn their anger on me for not warning them this was coming. But as I looked down at the ceremonial check in my hands, thought about Jerry Morrison's daughter riding her bike, Maria Santos sleeping through the night in an apartment where she felt safe, Henry Park feeding his cats on his balcony, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. Victoria had asked earlier what I'd accomplished, managing a rundown building for people who couldn't pay market rent. She'd meant it as an insult, proof of my failure to thrive in the world she valued. She'd never understand that I'd already succeeded at something far more important than wealth. I'd created home for people who needed it. I'd honored my grandmother's legacy of service. I'd chosen purpose over profit, community over status, and truth over the comfortable lies my family had told themselves about success. The gala was over. The real work was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't the broke little sister in the clearance rack dress. I was Colonel Sarah Bennett, and I was done hiding. The morning after the gala, I woke to 73 missed calls and 147 text messages. Most were from reporters who'd gotten my number somehow, asking for interviews about the dramatic revelation at Victoria's event. Several were from veterans organizations offering support and resources. 3 were from my mother, each one more desperate than the last, begging me to call her back so we could talk about this misunderstanding. The only call I returned was Eleanor's. She arrived at my apartment in Magnolia Gardens an hour later carrying 2 coffees and a briefcase full of documents. We sat at my small kitchen table while she spread papers across the surface like a general planning a campaign. "The Attorney General's office moved fast," she said, sliding a folder toward me. "They executed a warrant on Victoria's foundation offices at 6 this morning. Seized computers, financial records, correspondence files. Everything." I opened the folder to find photographs of Victoria's office, stripped bare by investigators. Her sleek glass desk empty, her filing cabinets tagged with evidence markers, her walls naked where expensive art had hung yesterday morning. "They also froze her accounts," Eleanor continued. "Personal and business. She can't access any of the foundation money or move assets until the investigation concludes. And Sarah, they found things even we didn't know about." She pulled out another document, a forensic accounting report that had been compiled overnight by state investigators. The numbers were staggering. Victoria hadn't just skimmed administrative fees from the foundation. She'd created an entire network of false vendors, fabricated service contracts, and phantom recipients. Money that donors thought was going to veteran job training programs had instead funded Victoria's lifestyle for the past 18 months. $200,000 for a veteran's mental health initiative that never existed, Eleanor read aloud. $350,000 for housing assistance that was actually Victoria's brownstone down payment. Another $120,000 for employment workshops that turned out to be her personal shopping trips categorized as business expenses. My stomach turned as I flipped through page after page of fraud. How did she think she'd get away with this? "Same way most people like her think they'll get away with it," Eleanor said grimly. "Arrogance." She assumed no one would look closely. Charitable foundations have minimal oversight unless someone files a complaint. And who would complain? She made sure to donate just enough to legitimate causes that if anyone asked questions, she could point to real outcomes. A few thousand here and there to veteran organizations, enough to generate thank you letters and photo opportunities, while pocketing the rest. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from my father. I stared at his name on the screen, remembering his words from last night. A real career. That money could set you up. He'd been so certain that selling Magnolia Gardens was the right decision, so ready to dismiss my work as meaningless. You should answer, Eleanor said quietly. They'll need to hear this from you eventually. I accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Eleanor could hear. Dad. Sarah. His voice sounded hollow, decades older than it had yesterday. Your mother and I are outside. Can we come up? I looked at Eleanor, who nodded. 10th floor, apartment 1012. They arrived 5 minutes later looking like they'd aged years overnight. My mother's eyes were red and swollen from crying. My father's shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before, the confident posture of the man who'd lectured me about responsibility and ambition completely gone. We didn't know, my mother said before she'd even fully entered the apartment. Sarah, you have to believe us. We had no idea about any of it. The military service, the medals, the property ownership. Victoria told us she'd been managing everything, that she'd talked to you, that you'd agreed to the sale. Did you ever ask me directly? I kept my voice level, watching them both flinch at the question. Did either of you pick up the phone and call me to discuss selling property you thought I was just managing? Or did you just assume Victoria was handling it all? My father sank onto my couch without being invited, his head in his hands. She showed us documents. Profit and loss statements showing the building was barely breaking even. Market analyses proving we were losing money every month by keeping rents so low. She made it sound like we were being foolish, like Magnolia Gardens was a drain on the family finances. Except it's not family finances, I said. It's my property. Grandmother left it to me 3 years ago through a trust. I own Magnolia Gardens completely. You never had any stake to sell. My mother's legs seemed to give out. She grabbed the back of a chair for support, staring at me with an expression somewhere between shock and betrayal. But the family meetings. Victoria said there was a vote. She said it was unanimous. A vote about property none of you owned, Eleanor interjected calmly. Based on financial projections that were deliberately falsified to make the building look unprofitable when it's actually quite stable. Your daughter Victoria orchestrated an elaborate fraud to steal property from your daughter Sarah while convincing you that you were making a sound business decision. No, my mother whispered. No, Victoria wouldn't. She's successful, she's smart, she would never need to steal from family. She stole almost $1 million from the foundation, I said, sliding the forensic report across the table. Money that veterans desperately needed. Money that donors gave in good faith. She used it to fund a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford on her salary. My father picked up the report with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the numbers. With each page, his face grew grayer. When he finally set it down, he looked at me with something I'd never seen in his expression before. Shame. Real, deep shame that went beyond embarrassment into genuine horror at what he'd enabled. The Attorney General is pressing charges, Eleanor said. Fraud, embezzlement, theft by deception, and elder abuse for the scheme involving your mother Maggie's property. Victoria's looking at potentially 15 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. Elder abuse? My mother's voice broke. But mother died 3 years ago. The statute covers schemes that began while the victim was still alive, Eleanor explained. Maggie structured the trust specifically to protect the property from Victoria. The evidence suggests Victoria was already planning to contest the will before Maggie passed. That demonstrates intent to defraud an elderly person of their assets. My father stood abruptly, pacing to my window that overlooked the courtyard where Jerry Morrison's daughter was riding her bike. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. We raised her to value success. To be ambitious. To not settle for less than she deserved. His voice cracked. Somewhere along the way, we taught her that success meant money and status, and nothing else mattered. You taught both of us that, I said quietly. The difference is I learned something else from grandmother. That service matters. That community matters. That home is more than equity and investment potential. My mother came to stand beside me, her hand hovering near my arm but not quite touching, like she'd lost the right to that casual intimacy. Why didn't you tell us? About the military, about the deployments, about any of it? I tried, I said, and realized it was true. After my first deployment, I came home with stories. I wanted to share what I'd seen, what we'd accomplished. You changed the subject to ask when I was going to settle down and find a real job. After my second deployment, when I was still recovering from injuries, you asked if I was finally ready to give up playing soldier and do something meaningful with my life. She flinched like I'd struck her. I said that. Christmas dinner, 2021. Dad agreed that military service was fine for people who couldn't make it in the private sector, but I had potential for more. My father's reflection in the window showed tears streaming down his face. I don't remember saying that. I do, I said. I remember every time you dismissed my service as a phase. Every time you held up Victoria's corporate success as the standard I should aspire to. Every time you made it clear that what I was doing with my life disappointed you. So eventually, I stopped trying to explain. I stopped sharing. I let you believe whatever story made you comfortable. Eleanor stood, gathering her documents with practiced efficiency. The Attorney General wants Sarah's statement on record by tomorrow. There's also the matter of the Pinnacle Properties contract. Victoria forged signatures on preliminary agreements. That adds another layer of fraud to the charges. We didn't sign anything, my father said quickly. She said the papers weren't ready yet, that she'd bring them to us next week. Smart, Eleanor nodded. She was waiting until the last possible moment to get your signatures, probably planning to pressure you right before closing. Made it harder for anyone to back out or ask questions. But she did get Richard's signature on several documents. My mother looked up sharply. Richard signed? Extensive documentation, Eleanor confirmed. He was more involved than you realized. In fact, the evidence suggests he approached Victoria initially about selling the property. He's been facing financial difficulties and saw Magnolia Gardens as a solution. Victoria ran with his idea and expanded it into the full scheme. Uncle Richard. I thought about family dinners where he'd complained about the burden of maintaining grandmother's assets, about how they were all tied up in property that generated minimal return. I'd thought he was just making conversation. He'd been plotting. Is he being charged too? My father asked. Under investigation, Eleanor said. The Attorney General is building the case carefully. They want everyone involved, not just Victoria. My phone buzzed with an alert. A news notification. Local executive arrested in veterans charity fraud. Below it, a photo of Victoria being led from her brownstone in handcuffs, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. The same expression she'd worn when things didn't go her way as a child, except now the tantrum had legal consequences. My mother saw the photo and let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Oh God. Everyone will see. Everyone will know. That's what broke my heart. Not horror at what Victoria had done. Not concern for the veterans she'd defrauded or the families she'd tried to displace. But worry about what people would think, about the family reputation, about their social standing at the country club. Mom, I said gently, everyone already knows. It's not about managing the story anymore. It's about facing the truth. She looked at me then, really looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time. You're nothing like her. Nothing like either of us. You're like Mother. I know, I said. That's why she trusted me with Magnolia Gardens. Eleanor left shortly after, promising to be in touch about the statement and the ongoing investigation. My parents lingered, neither seeming to know what to say or how to leave. Finally, my father cleared his throat. What happens now? To the building, to the residence? Life goes on, I said simply. The grant from the governor's office will fund the new water heaters I've been putting off, plus renovations to the community room and updates to several units. The residents stay in their homes at rents they can afford. Magnolia Gardens continues doing exactly what grandmother intended. And Victoria? Victoria faces the consequences of her choices. Same as everyone else. My mother moved toward the door, then turned back. Sarah, I know we have no right to ask, but when this goes to trial, when they need testimony about character and family history, would you consider speaking on Victoria's behalf? For leniency. The request hung in the air between us. She wanted me to be the bigger person, to show mercy, to help my sister avoid the full weight of justice. The same way I'd been expected my entire life to step aside, to accept less, to make myself smaller so Victoria could shine brighter. No, I said quietly. I won't help her avoid consequences for stealing from veterans and trying to make families homeless. But I won't testify against her either. The evidence speaks for itself. She did this to herself, Mom. I'm just making sure she can't do it to anyone else. After they left, I stood at my window watching the courtyard below. Maria Santos was teaching a self-defense class to some of the younger women residents. Henry Park sat on his balcony with his cats, peaceful in the afternoon sun. Jerry Morrison's daughter had convinced 2 other children to join her bike riding, their laughter floating up through the spring air. This was what I'd protected. Not property values or investment potential, but actual lives being lived with dignity and security. Grandmother had known Victoria would eventually show her true nature. She'd prepared for it, given me the tools I needed to fight back, and trusted that I'd choose the harder right over the easier wrong. The battle wasn't over. The trial would come, my family would fracture further, and Victoria would fight with everything she had. But standing there, watching my community thrive, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. And this time, I wasn't fighting alone. 6 months later, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom number 4 in the Richmond Circuit Court, straightening my dress uniform one final time. The medals on my chest caught the fluorescent light, each one representing a mission, a sacrifice, a moment when I'd chosen duty over comfort. Today they represented something else. Proof that service meant more than Victoria had ever understood. Eleanor adjusted her own uniform beside me, her lieutenant colonel insignia gleaming. She'd insisted on wearing her dress blues today, standing in solidarity. Behind us, 15 residents from Magnolia Gardens waited quietly. They'd asked to attend, to bear witness to the conclusion of a story that had almost destroyed their homes. The courtroom doors opened and we filed in, taking our seats behind the prosecution table. Victoria sat with her defense team across the aisle, wearing a conservative gray suit that was probably meant to make her look humble and remorseful. She didn't look at me as we entered, keeping her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. My parents sat in the back row, having attended every day of the 3-week trial. They looked exhausted, caught between loyalty to a daughter who'd committed crimes and the undeniable truth that had been presented piece by piece over days of testimony. Uncle Richard hadn't come. He was facing his own charges, awaiting his separate trial. The jury had deliberated for 8 hours yesterday before the judge sent them home for the night. This morning, they'd resumed at 9 and sent word an hour ago that they'd reached a verdict. Now we waited for them to return and deliver judgment. Governor Caldwell entered quietly, taking a seat near the back. She caught my eye and nodded once, a gesture of support and respect. The media section was packed with reporters who'd been covering the trial religiously. What had started as a story about charity fraud had grown into something larger, a symbol of everything wrong with how society valued wealth over service, image over substance. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Marcus Williams presiding. Judge Williams took his seat, surveying the crowded courtroom with the weary expression of someone who'd heard too many cases like this one. Please be seated. I understand the jury has reached a verdict. We have, Your Honor, the jury forewoman said, standing with a folder in her hands. The defendant will rise. Victoria stood with her lawyers flanking her, her chin lifted in defiance even now. Some part of her still believed this was all a misunderstanding, that her expensive legal team would somehow make this disappear the way money had always made her problems disappear before. On the charge of charitable fraud in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Victoria's knees buckled slightly. Her lead attorney grabbed her elbow to steady her. On the charge of embezzlement, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of theft by deception, how do you find? Guilty. With each guilty verdict, I watched my sister shrink. The confident woman who'd mocked me at her gala, who'd plotted to steal my property and displace vulnerable families, was disappearing before my eyes. In her place stood someone facing the reality that actions had consequences, even for people who'd always been shielded from them. On the charge of elder abuse and exploitation, how do you find? Guilty. My mother's sob echoed through the silent courtroom. My father had his arm around her, his own face buried against her shoulder. They were losing their golden child to the prison system, watching the daughter they'd been so proud of being convicted of crimes they'd never imagined she could commit. Judge Williams accepted the verdict forms from the bailiff, reviewing them carefully. The jury is polled and the verdict is recorded. Ms. Bennett, you have been found guilty on all charges. Sentencing is scheduled for 4 weeks from today, during which time you will remain in custody without bail given the severity of these crimes and the flight risk assessment. Your Honor, Victoria's lawyer stood quickly. We request that my client be allowed to remain free on bond pending sentencing. She's cooperated fully with this process and poses no danger to the community. She stole nearly $1 million from veterans, Judge Williams said flatly. She attempted to defraud her own family and displace 45 families from their homes for personal profit. The court considers these actions both a danger to the community and evidence of moral character that suggests flight risk. The defendant is remanded to custody immediately. The bailiffs approached Victoria, producing handcuffs. She turned to look at me then, finally, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or arrogance or even fear. Incomprehension. She genuinely could not understand how she'd ended up here, how everything she'd built had collapsed so completely. Sarah, she said, her voice breaking as the bailiff secured the handcuffs. Please. Tell them you forgive me. Tell them I made mistakes but I'm still your sister. I met her eyes across the courtroom. You are my sister. You'll always be my sister. But that doesn't mean I can protect you from the consequences of stealing from people who gave everything for this country. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice, Victoria. They led her away through the side door, her expensive suit and perfect hair jarring against the institutional reality of the handcuffs and bailiffs. My mother's sobs grew louder as Victoria disappeared. My father sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters rushed out to file their stories about the verdict. The residents from Magnolia Gardens approached me one by one, offering quiet words of gratitude and support. Jerry Morrison shook my hand firmly, his daughter holding his other hand. Maria Santos hugged me, whispering thank you against my shoulder. Henry Park simply nodded, understanding passing between us without words needed. Eleanor waited until everyone else had left before speaking. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you. You know that, right? I hope so, I said, looking down at my medals. I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly what would make her proud. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Veterans advocacy groups holding signs supporting accountability for charity fraud. Media crews conducting interviews. And standing at the edge of it all, Governor Caldwell with her chief of staff. She approached as I descended the courthouse steps. Colonel Bennett. Walk with me. We moved away from the crowds, Eleanor trailing at a respectful distance. The governor waited until we had relative privacy before speaking. The State Veterans Affairs Board voted this morning. They'd like to offer you a position as Director of Housing Initiatives. It would mean overseeing programs across Virginia, developing policy, ensuring what happened with your sister's foundation never happens again. I appreciate the offer, Governor, but I'm needed at Magnolia Gardens. She smiled like she'd expected that answer. The position would be part-time, allowing you to continue managing the property. We need people who understand the work from the ground level, Sarah. People who've lived it, not just studied it. I thought about what that could mean. The ability to protect not just one building, but hundreds. To ensure that veterans across Virginia had advocates who understood what they needed, what they'd sacrificed, what they deserved. I'll consider it, I said finally. Good. Take your time. The board knows you're worth waiting for. She left, and I stood on the courthouse steps watching Richmond move around me. Somewhere in this city, Victoria was being processed into the county jail, beginning a journey that would likely end with years in prison. My parents were probably at home, trying to process how their family had fractured so completely. Uncle Richard was preparing his own defense, knowing his trial was coming. But here, in this moment, justice had been served. Not the revenge Victoria had accused me of seeking, but actual justice. Accountability for crimes committed, protection for vulnerable people, and consequences that matched actions. My phone buzzed. A message from Maria Santos with a photo attached. The residents had gathered in the community room for an impromptu celebration. The banner they'd hung read, "Home is where the heart is, thanks to Colonel Sarah." That's what this had all been about. Not property values or investment returns or family legacies measured in dollars. Home. Safety. Community. The things my grandmother had understood mattered most. I headed back to Magnolia Gardens, trading my dress uniform for work clothes. There were still water heaters to replace, maintenance requests to review, and a community to serve. The governor's offer would wait. The media attention would fade. But the work would continue, day after day, proving that sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning against others, but building something that lasts beyond yourself. Victoria had called me broke at her gala, dismissed my life as a failure of ambition. She'd measured success in designer gowns and luxury properties and zeros in a bank account. She'd never understood that true wealth was measured in the Morrison daughters' laughter, in Maria's peaceful sleep, in Henry's contentment feeding his cats on a balcony he could afford to keep. I'd chosen service over status, community over wealth, and purpose over profit. And standing in the courtyard of Magnolia Gardens that evening, watching my residents sharing dinner and stories, children playing safely while their parents finally felt secure, I knew I'd made the right choice. Grandmother had trusted me with more than property. She'd trusted me with a legacy of service, a commitment to caring for people that money couldn't buy and status couldn't measure. Victoria had tried to destroy that legacy for profit. Instead, she'd only proven how valuable it truly was. The fight was over. The work continued. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.